Immanuel Kant. In the city of Königsberg, Germany, in the late 1700s, a neatly dressed man emerged from his doorway in preparation for an afternoon stroll. When they saw him, his neighbors automatically glanced at their clocks. It was 4 o'clock. The man stepped onto the street and began to walk along an avenue lined with linden trees, known as the Philosopher's Walk. As he passed by, other residents and shopkeepers would remark silently to themselves, "Ah, it must be 4:15. Or, further along his route, "Yes, it is 4:30 now." An hour later, the man had completed his walk, and exactly at 5 o'clock, he arrived back home and disappeared inside again. Every single day for his entire adult life, Immanuel Kant followed the same routine. He left his house, rain or shine, at 4. He returned at 5. It was well known in Königsberg that anyone who needed to could set their clocks by the schedule of Professor Kant. The life of Immanuel Kant was orderly and meticulous. He himself was quiet and mannerly, a man who never changed his profession or residence, who didn't travel, who never married or had children, and who lived on the surface a life almost completely devoid of drama or glamour. Yet within this seemingly dull little professor was one of the most influential thinkers in history. Kant is the great giant of 18th century philosophy and a pivotal figure of the Enlightenment, also known as the Age of Reason. His famous book, The Critique of Pure Reason, was a comprehensive and thorough work that synthesized the two great philosophies of his time, rationalism and empiricism. Kant lived in the right place at just the right moment to gain acceptance for his revolutionary ideas about the human mind. He helped usher in a new era when the most important ideas in philosophy would emanate from Western Europe. Centuries before, at the time of the Renaissance, European thought was dominated by the influence of Mediterranean thinkers, many of them from northern Italy. By his age, more than 300 years later, the sources of influence were widening. The ideas of the French Revolution were having impact, as were the ideas of English thinkers like John Locke, and the ideas of American political thinkers like Jefferson and Franklin. At just this time, the small German states entered the stage, and their contribution had a subtle influence on the entire course of history. One sign of the shift in influence was the rise of the German Romantic poets, the most famous of which was Goethe. The other sign was the beginning of a tradition of German philosophy, and its founder was Kant. He remains the most important philosopher of the many that Germany produced. The problems of philosophy in the 17th and 18th centuries were related to the advances in science taking place then. The new challenge was to find foundations for the new science, to transfer discoveries in that field to the field of human thought, and to integrate scientific points of view with religious, spiritual, or metaphysical points of view. During these 2 centuries, many philosophers were also scientists, and scientists became philosophers. There was a blending of the two fields, and each influenced the other. Kant was among the most important of these scientist philosophers. He was trained as a mathematician and physicist, and made an original contribution to science in 1775, when he put forward his theory of the origin of the solar system. He was the first one to propose that the planets had been condensed from a mass of gas. From his experience with math and science, Kant became sure there must also be some stable and absolute principles about the human mind. Science and math contain so many universal and necessary principles, principles that were commonly acknowledged, that he felt it would be folly to assume that the human mind didn't also operate according to universal principles. It was not until he was 45 years old, inspired by these thoughts, that he began trying to apply these principles to the problems of philosophy. It was in this year that he had the great revelation that some knowledge must be a priori in order to make science possible at all, and this idea turned his career in an entirely new direction. The term a priori is so central to Kant's work and to his place in history, it's important to know a little about it before plunging into his life. Kant accepted the belief, set forth by philosophers before him, that all knowledge arises out of experience or observation. This is what's meant by empirical knowledge. but he also believed that some of our reasons for understanding experience could come before we actually experience them. For instance, if you look at a pair of rose-colored glasses, you can know that if you put them on, everything will appear rosier. You know that because the lens of the glasses are rose, and you don't have to wear them to know it. Therefore, you could form an argument that things will appear rosy prior to your experience of it. As a name for this prior-to-experience argument, Kant used the Latin phrase a priori. The term a priori is now a standard term in the language of philosophy. It refers to ideas that occur independent of experience. The opposite of a priori is what Kant and everyone since calls a posteriori, coming from posterior or after. A judgment is a priori if its truth can be known without reference to experience. It is a posteriori if it cannot be known until after an experience. All inductive arguments, all arguments that involve going out and looking for evidence to prove or disprove a point, are a posteriori arguments, since they use the stuff of experience to make their point. Because of the nature of this a priori knowledge, Kant began to call his philosophy transcendental, since the knowledge it discovered transcended experience in the sense that it had an a priori basis in the mind. He later attempted to withdraw this title when it began to be misunderstood by others to mean a knowledge of things transcending experience, such as God, a meaning which was the furthest thing from Kant's mind. Kant's declared goal was this: to disprove that we have a faculty of pure reason which can arrive at truths about the world independent of ourselves. He felt when we make judgments about the world, the understanding is dependent on certain a priori concepts. Immanuel Kant was born April 22, 1724, in Königsberg, East Prussia, the son of a saddle maker. His life on the surface was completely uneventful, and he hardly moved outside of Königsberg for the whole of it. Of course, it's true that most philosophers' lives are devoted chiefly to reflection and not to public displays of grandeur. Their greatness is completely different from that of explorers, military leaders, or artists. It's a quiet greatness. Still, given the martyr's death of Socrates, the flamboyance of Voltaire, and the madness of Nietzsche, Kant seems unusually quiet. So quiet that a scholar once said it was impossible to write a life of Kant because he had no life. But this might be exactly what makes Kant such an interesting character: the amazing contrast between his quiet, little, uneventful life and the tremendous influence he had on Western humanity. Kant had a pious upbringing that seemed to influence his lifestyle later and also his ethical writings. The Kant family belonged to a church similar to that of Quakers, based on temperance, benevolence, and strict moral duty. He once wrote, "Morality is not properly the doctrine of how we make ourselves happy, but how we make ourselves worthy of happiness." His parents couldn't afford to educate their son, but a local pastor took an interest in him and helped finance his elementary school education, where he mostly studied Latin. After that, he went to the University of Königsberg, where he helped pay his fees with his winnings at billiards and by writing sermons for his friends who were studying for the ministry. Kant, too, originally intended to study theology, but found himself drawn instead to philosophy and science. He dabbled in physics, astronomy, and mathematics, and was given special use of his professor's library to immerse himself in the writings of Isaac Newton. His dissertation was on the subject of the proper formula for measuring kinetic energy. When he graduated, Kant was completely out of money, so he took a post in an area of East Prussia, working as a private tutor for children of the aristocrats. He stayed almost 8 years, still making barely enough to survive. It seemed as if Kant, in these years, picked up just as much from his employers as their children picked up from him. For when he emerged, he had the style of a gentleman, courtly in his manner and dapper in his dress. He then returned to the University of Königsberg, when offered a position there as a teacher of philosophy. His stint as a tutor in the nearby countryside of Königsberg was the only time he left his native city during his entire life. When he was 46, Kant was promoted to the chair of logic and metaphysics, after first turning down an offer to serve as head of the poetry department at the University of Berlin. It was a far more prestigious position, but Kant didn't want to leave the comfort and quietness of Königsberg. He stayed in his post there for the next 34 years, until his death at age 80. As a professor, Kant lectured on a vast array of subjects that included not just logic and metaphysics, but physics, math, geography, anthropology, mineralogy, and pedagogy, the profession of teaching. He was a superb and very popular lecturer, known for the way he departed from the text, critiqued them, and threw in witty and amusing anecdotes. He said that his main aim as a teacher was to stimulate his listeners to think for themselves and stand on their own feet. One of his students recalled after many years, "Playfulness, wit, and humor were at his command. His lectures were the most entertaining talks. The history of men and peoples, natural history and science, mathematics and observation were the sources from which he enlivened his lectures and conversation. He was indifferent to nothing worth knowing. No cabal, no sect, no prejudice, no desire for fame could ever tempt him in the slightest from broadening and illuminating the truth. He incited and gently forced others to think for themselves. Despotism was foreign to his mind." Although Kant didn't travel, and though he spent the remainder of his life at the university, his life was by no means reclusive. In his role as professor and head of the logic and metaphysics department, he came into contact with many students and other intellectuals and scholars. In addition, his town was a crossroads of trade, visited by many travelers with whom he was very sociable. Magister Kant, as he was called, was much sought after in all circles of Königsberg society, among merchants and army officers, by the middle class as well as the nobility. He was considered an excellent conversationalist and a man of the world, even though the geographic boundaries of that world were uniquely restricted. His nickname was the Gallant Doctor. Visitors from the big cities were often astounded at the breadth of knowledge held by this mild professor in this obscure small town. His knowledge, of course, came almost exclusively from reading. That is probably why, in spite of his enormous intellect, one of his closest friends said that his greatest characteristic was his childlikeness. Kant's constant curiosity about developments in science, politics, and other subjects was well supplied by these frequent conversations and constant reading. He was one of the great teachers at the university, admired and remembered by both his students and by others who attended his clear, stimulating, and witty public lectures. In physical appearance, Kant was a small man, barely 5 feet tall, ascetic and thin-looking, and slightly misshapen. He had a shrunken chest and a hump on one shoulder. There was nothing robust about him, yet he was seldom ill, probably because of the settled and disciplined life he led. He described himself as never sick, but never well. He was a model of punctuality, accustomed to regulate not just his walks, but his entire daily routine around the clock. A German poet who knew him said his life was like the most regular of regular verbs. He did everything at the same hour every day. Kant would rise shortly before 5 in the morning and spend the first hour drinking tea, smoking a pipe, and thinking over the day ahead of him. From 6 to 7 he prepared his lecture, which began at 7 or 8 according to the time of year, and lasted until 9 or 10. Until lunch he devoted himself to writing. Lunch was always spent in the company of others and often lasted several hours if Kant was enjoying the conversation. Afterwards he took his renowned afternoon walks, which always lasted precisely 1 hour. In the evening he read and reflected. At 10 o'clock every night he went to bed. He was a confirmed bachelor, although it said he enjoyed the company of ladies who were well educated. Though not a sentimental man, Kant was sincere and loyal in his friendships. Kant had no taste for the fine arts, for music, for imaginative literature, or even for natural beauty, and he seems to have been unable to call up visual images to his mind. He did have, however, a deep interest in the politics of his time, and was sympathetic with both the American and French revolutions. His politics were always liberal, as suited the age of enlightenment, and his religion could best be described as unorthodox Protestant. On the surface, Kant seemed the last man to sympathize with any revolution, much less to cause his own revolution in philosophy. Order and law, coherence and consistency were the chief characteristics of his being. For each and every matter he formulated an appropriate maxim and held to it. His nature was so deep and serious that it prevented him from leaving anything in his life to chance. He once fired a faithful servant who had been with him for years, a man named Lampe, and when he couldn't dismiss this troubling incident from his mind, he wrote in his journal, "Remember from now on, the name of Lampe must be completely forgotten." Despite the humorous contradiction in that reminder, it's a perfect example of his discipline and attention to detail. These same traits are apparent in his career as a thinker and writer. He always kept in view a specific goal and determined a route to arrive there. In his first published work, he wrote, "I have already traced the course I want to follow. I shall set forth on my way, and nothing shall keep me from holding to it." The study in his house, where he did most of his reading and writing, was simple and barely furnished. It lacked any decoration, except one painting on the wall, a portrait of the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Kant had a great reverence for Rousseau. It said that he only once departed from the fixed schedule of his daily routine, and that was the day he skipped his afternoon walk to continue reading Rousseau's newly released novel, Emile. When he was 40, Kant himself described the influence Rousseau had had on him. He said, "I am by inclination a seeker after truth. I feel a consuming thirst for knowledge and a restless passion to advance in it, as well as satisfaction in every forward step. There was a time when I thought that this alone could constitute the honor of mankind, and I despised the common man who knows nothing. Rousseau set me right. This blind prejudice vanished. I learned to respect human nature, and I should consider myself far more useless than the ordinary working man if I did not believe that this view could give worth to all others to establish the rights of man." Rousseau and his famous work, The Social Contract, are featured in another session of the 100 Greatest People. Kant's productivity was remarkable, especially in the period after 1770, when he was 46 and his new philosophy began to take shape and occupy his mind. That was the year he was elected to the chair of logic and metaphysics at the university, and in his inaugural lecture he outlined his new ideas, which would later be published in his greatest work, The Critique of Pure Reason. He also wrote a number of early minor works, which have become known as the pre-critical writings. Then, after a period of silence, he published The Critique of Pure Reason in 1781. He revised it and released a second edition 6 years later. In 1788, he released The Critique of Practical Reason, which is concerned with ethics. The third critique, The Critique of Judgment, was published in 1790 and was concerned largely with aesthetics. Kant also wrote on, among other things, politics, what was then called anthropology, but which we know today as psychology, and religion, the latter of which caused him some problems with the church and his king. He was a scholar, an academic, a very moral and upstanding citizen, but even he was capable of upsetting the authorities in this age of revolutions. He got into trouble with his view that man and nature are fundamentally in accord when he failed to mention God as part of the accord. According to Kant, some a priori knowledge of nature was inborn in man, and also some a priori knowledge of morality. The Church was alarmed by this, and in 1792, when the French Revolution had begun and authorities everywhere were nervous, it blocked the publication in Berlin of some of Kant's works on religion. Kant had these works published in Königsberg instead, and was promptly forbidden by the King of Prussia to lecture or publish further works on religious matters. He obeyed this command as long as the king lived, but gave up much of his teaching and withdrew into a melancholy protest. As soon as the king died, however, he considered himself released from his promise and published a work in which he discussed the relation between theology and critical reason. From then on, he was back in his super-production mode, creating an astounding number of works until his death only 6 years later. The core of Kant's work and philosophy is to be found in his three critiques, and most particularly in the first one, the Critique of Pure Reason. This book founded a new school of philosophical thought that drew many of the most creative and profound minds of Europe. Many of Kant's first followers were men who passed through the small town of Weimar, where the writer Goethe was Minister of Education. Goethe was an ardent fan of Kant and never hesitated to promote him among his friends. Others were introduced to Kant at the University of Jena, where the philosopher Johann Fichte lectured enthusiastically on his behalf, and also on behalf of the French Revolution. Some of the best romantic poets became disciples of Kant, and, of course, many succeeding philosophers drew inspiration from him, one of the first being George Hegel, who in turn became very influential himself. Soon there was a constellation of geniuses and artists, all swirling about Kant and his new philosophy. Although he achieved great fame through his philosophical works, Kant never became wealthy off them. This didn't seem to concern him, however. Not only did he have other goals in writing his books, but it's hard to imagine what a man of his simple and austere ways could have done with much money. Although not rich, Kant was a generous man and regularly helped poor people and made donations to worthy causes. In his final years, Kant's mental power steadily declined, but the town of Königsberg remained proud of him to the end. He taught until 3 years before his death, on February 12, 1804, at the age of 80, and when he died, he was given a spectacular funeral. There are very few philosophers who can claim the same tribute. By the time Kant died, his philosophy was being taught in most German universities and was beginning to be known in France and England. Kant covered an enormous range of subjects in his writing, but the one work that had the most impact was the Critique of Pure Reason. It's actually the first part of a set of 3 works commonly called as a unit the Critiques. But Kant's writings on pure reason are the most famous and fundamental part of these works. The other 2 works are the Critique of Practical Reason and the Critique of Judgment. The Critique of Pure Reason is divided into 2 parts. The first deals with the sources of human knowledge, and the second deals with the proper and improper uses of reason. From Kant's point of view, both rationalism, the use of reason to obtain knowledge, and empiricism, the idea that knowledge comes from experience, had reached, in his words, a dark, confused, and useless dead end. He proposed a synthesis in which both experience and reason worked together to form understanding. Reason became the means by which experience was translated into knowledge. The title of the Critique of Pure Reason in a way reveals the goal of the author. Kant, who had a Scottish background himself, had studied the Scottish philosopher David Hume, and once remarked that it was Hume who had awakened him from his dogmatic slumbers. In fact, Hume had managed to startle a great number of people. He did this by maintaining that certain knowledge wasn't perceived through the senses, but was imposed on the senses by man's mind. This idea destroyed once and for all any possibility of developing a dogmatic philosophy, that is, a philosophy of inarguable statements about the true nature of things. Since such dogmatic philosophy was no longer acceptable, Kant held that the skeptical position, or as he called it, the critical position, was all that was left to philosophy. But where Hume had tried to explain concepts in terms of experience, Kant set out to explain experience in terms of concepts. He began to express his doubt about the philosophy of his time and became particularly interested in the question, how is metaphysics possible? The answer, which he supplied in the first critique, is that if metaphysics tries to go beyond the limits imposed by the nature of human understanding, it's not possible. These attempts just end in contradictions and incoherence. Any future metaphysics must therefore be limited to the bounds of human understanding. In effect, Kant was trying to understand and define the scope of the human mind. In his critique, Kant claims to show what happens when reason tries to go beyond the bounds of experience and tries to make claims about metaphysical truths and reality itself. What Kant aimed to set forth were the limits of pure reason, and he had to solve this problem by logical means. This is one of his greatest contributions to philosophy, that he defined the limits which the human mind is capable of attaining, and that he shunned any insoluble problems or questions that were beyond these limits. The existence of God, freedom, and immortality, he said, couldn't be solved by scientific thought. Kant maintained that our reason has the peculiar fate to be troubled by questions which spring from the very nature of reason, and yet which transcend the powers of reason. Our mind asks the very questions our minds can't answer. Therefore, we have to set up a sort of court of appeals, a court in which the claims of reason may be heard. And Kant said that his book, The Critique of Pure Reason, was that court. The question he proposed was, what can we hope to achieve with reason when all the material assistance of experience is taken away? What happens in the mind without experience to fuel it? Experience is, without doubt, the first product of our understanding, but it can only tell us what is, not what can be. So we must penetrate into a region beyond our experience to consider the inevitable problems of reason itself, the questions our reason asks that can't be answered, such as questions about God, freedom, and immortality. Of the processes by which our knowledge reaches its object or its destination, there is one process that reaches it directly. That is, intuition. Intuition is therefore one way by which we receive impressions and obtain content for our knowledge. In addition, there is thought, with its fundamental ideas or concepts. Thoughts without content are empty. Intuitions without content are blind. For the understanding cannot see, and the senses cannot think. Thus it becomes necessary to use what Kant called transcendental logic. It serves as a law of critical knowledge. Kant established a table of judgments based on logic which he believed could determine all the possible forms of our knowledge. There are basically four of these judgment categories or mental compartments: quantity, quality, relation, such as cause and effect, and modality, which includes possibility, reality, and necessity. These categories control how we experience things. Kant said that after we've traveled across the whole domain of human understanding, we find it's an island, a land of truth surrounded by a wide and stormy ocean which tempts us to believe in new lands and thus involves us in adventures which we can never leave and yet which never bring an end. Even though we know that our categories, which were deduced for the sake of experience, can never transcend the limits of possible experience, we are bound to venture out upon the unknown sea of the metaphysical. This illusion which besets the mind isn't simple and can't easily be banished from our thought. What we have in our mind is a system of transcendental ideas which claims there must be within the mind a thinking being or soul, which claims the world must have had a beginning in time, which claims there must be a supreme being. But in reasoning upon these propositions, we cannot come to any rational conclusions. A rational psychology of the soul is impossible to Kant, and transcends the powers of human reason. The human self is indeed a knower, but it doesn't know itself through the categories. It knows the categories through itself. He concluded that reason can provide knowledge only of things as they appear to us, never of things as they are in themselves. In spite of this, he said, there is a demand for a solution of problems in which reason has a deep interest. The questions are whether the world was created in time and space, whether my thinking self is indivisible and indestructible, whether I am free or am led by the hand of fate, and whether there is a supreme cause or purpose of the world. These are the foundation stones on which morals and religion are built up. When it's said that there's a supreme being and that everything which thinks is immortal, and then on the other side it said there is no supreme being nor an immortal soul, the conflict is one which can't be decided. So the controversy is one which should be avoided. For how can two persons argue about subjects whose reality they can never affirm or deny? Both parties beat the air and fight with their own shadows because they've gone beyond the limits of their nature, and there's nothing real they can hold on to. When I hear, he said, that some uncommon genius has demonstrated away the freedom of the human will, the hope of the future life, or the existence of God, I am certain, without having seen his book, that he hasn't disproved any single one of these doctrines. For the Transcendental Critique convinced me that, as reason can't establish affirmative propositions in this sphere of thought, it's even more powerless to establish negative ones. To Kant, the ultimate aim of pure reason is directed toward the understanding of these three objects: God, freedom, and immortality. But the ultimate purpose in considering these questions is really to determine what ought to be done if the will is free, and if there is God, and if there is a future world. Without a God, and without a world not visible to us now, the glorious ideas of morality wouldn't motivate us, for they would fail to achieve their original aim. The highest aim of pure reason is the ideal of the supreme good, a kingdom of grace in which morality and happiness are united in the form of the highest good. These are some of the general ideas in Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, in which he tried to refocus the traditions of philosophical thought. The task which Kant took on in his writings is best described by one of his own remarks. He compared his work in philosophy to the Copernican revolution in astronomy. Just as Copernicus, said Kant, had tried to shift the main problem in astronomy from that of the proper motion of the heavenly bodies to that of the proper motion of the earth, so he, Kant, now had to shift the main problem in philosophy from the attempt to view things as they are in themselves to the attempt to discover what the necessary principles and rules of the mind are. By understanding why and how the mind moves, we can then understand why things present to us the appearance which they do. As Copernicus had reversed the way scientists thought about the relationship of the earth and the sun, so Kant reversed the way philosophers thought about the relationship of the world of experience and the mind. The mind is not shaped by the world of experience, rather the world of experience is shaped by the patterns set by the mind. Although scientists were intrigued by his ideas, Kant had far greater impact on the non-scientific community, and that community was more interested in his ideas, particularly his moral ideas, than his methodology. To Kant, man and nature were no longer separate, so his philosophy seemed to give a new status to man. The knower and what he knows had moved closer to each other and were in greater accord. Man's reason was an instrument in tune with the workings of the universe. Man's morality was an instrument inborn in him, which needed no guide. Kant therefore gave humanity a new dignity, in which the limitations of nature were not obstacles, but the natural conditions of human freedom. Free will in man was a necessity of nature. His ideas about God, or whether God existed, also gave greater freedom to individuals, to every individual, whatever his ideas. He said that if the proof of the existence of God is impossible, so is a disproof. The illusion lies in thinking that anything can be established in this area. The idea of God is an idea of reason, and, like any such idea, has a regulative role only. Such a role, in Kant's view, is very legitimate. Such ideas have value if we think of them in an as-if way. That is to say, if we think about the world as if it were governed by what the idea implies. Today, Kant's thoughts may not seem revolutionary or even imaginative. We've come to take for granted the dignity of humankind, the abilities of our reason, and the remaining limitations to human thought. But in 1789 and onward, these were innovative and powerful ideas, and they helped propel Germany to the forefront of the intellectual movement guiding the Age of Enlightenment. This happened just at a time when the country had been lagging behind America, England, and France. The followers of the new Romantic movement in Germany felt that Kant gave sanction to their faith in the independence of man. An entire shift in human thought occurred. Kant was a quiet, conservative man with a conventional life, who seemed on the surface to be the last man to take up the challenge of historical thought and sweep it in a new direction. Like his ancient predecessor, Socrates, he was remarkably stationary. Never in his whole life was he more than 60 miles away from his hometown of Königsberg. Yet his influence, like that of Socrates, has turned out to be as wide as the world itself.
This is the end of the session.